All right. The next thing we need to look at is how legitimacy is determined in the United Kingdom, and they get it in two different ways. They are both traditional and rational legal in terms of where power is derived from, how people determine their interaction with the state. Uh, the unique thing about the United Kingdom is that they don't have a codified constitution, right? You can't get a pocket UK constitution like you can a pocket US constitution. That they are governed through the Constitution of the Crown, which originally was kind of the sovereign legal authority of the King or Queen, and that has evolved over time. That if you look at all of the documents from the previous two slides that I referenced, those two plus thousands of acts of parliament plus decisions of the courts kind of create an umbrella of precedent that the government has to adhere to that becomes known as common law. Common law guides the decisions that public officials and courts have to make that determine the principles for governance. One of the things that I'll give you later to read is an essay on how common law operates by a man named Blackstone, where you can kind of see how common law is utilized in the UK, and I'll share with you a second reading that has you look at whether or not the UK benefits or they are punished by not having a singular constitution like many other nations throughout the world. If we want to talk about their evolution over time, it's important to kind of look at how the role of the monarch has kind of changed, how they've gone from absolute power into more of a symbolic role, that things like the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the Parliament Act are all things that increase the legitimacy of Parliament, are all things that increase the authority of Parliament and decrease the authority of the king or the queen. And now the queen has some advise and consent powers where she can, ask the prime minister to do things, give advice to the prime minister on things, on appointments. But mostly the queen now fills a traditional head of state symbolic role. To happen alongside with the shaping of the monarch and the diminishment of their power, we've seen a dramatic increase in parliamentary power in the 902 years after the Magna Carta, where it's been a gradual change, that each of those documents that we looked at in the previous two slides all highlight differences or highlight different abilities that were given to Parliament over time. Finally, we saw gradualism in the extension of voting rights, where I talked to you about the reform acts that really increased the size of the voting eligible populace, that it's primarily spurred by the Industrial Revolution. So we already talked about the Great Reform Act of 1832 that gave 300,000 men the right to vote. In 1867, that was extended to workers who were given the right to vote. In 1918, you saw all men over the age of 21 and all women over the age of 28 deemed eligible to vote. And then in 1928, the voting age for women was also lowered to 21. That's where they, receive their legitimacy or their authority. So the question we need to look at now is what has created some political or economic shifts in the United Kingdom. And I think instead of starting in 1215 or starting in the old school trappings of a feudal political and economic model, really we start with post-World War II, where we see what's called the collective consensus, that you saw a political consensus where most Britons believed that the government should work to do a handful of things. The first is narrow the rich-poor gap. in the name of eliminating or reducing the rich-poor gap, we saw the birth of the welfare state, and that's part and parcel to the Belveridge report, where we're seeing cradle-to-grave benefits. We see the goal of creating full employment, which means less than a 4% unemployment rate, and they try to do things like offer pensions, offer access to health care through the NHS, offer things like unemployment assurance, and other traditional welfare programs. And the biggest agency to do these things, and also the biggest target for conservatives later in British political history, becomes the National Health Service. So in theory, the result of the collective consensus is the argument that the state is responsible for promoting economic growth and promoting full employment. So this leads to the installation of command economic structures. This leads to things like focusing on large, welfare benefits to try and equalize. So it's socialist elements that kind of eke their way into the economic policy making of the United Kingdom. So the question we need to ask is why does this happen after World War II? Why do you need a welfare state? And I think the answer is fairly easy. If you're familiar with what happens in the UK during both world wars, state involvement in the economy is gone. That they primarily become focused on directing the war effort, on helping alleviate elements of the Depression through some policy making, but they tend to embrace some laissez-faire elements of capitalism. After World War II, we have this Belveridge report that says the government needs to help rebuild. The government needs to help offer supports for a diminishing population because a lot of people died in the UK during and between the world wars. So it's the goal of the government to increase the quality of life, according to the Belveridge report. So it makes arguments that, if you have a diminishing population, you have old people who could not fight in the war, you have a lot of middle and young aged people who died in war efforts or, attacks on the United Kingdom, that you need to find ways to protect the children. So the Belveridge report argued for things like increasing child care, increasing benefits for mothers, safeguarding maternity and things like that, because if you need to rebuild a population, then you need to start when they are children. And once you have these protections for maternal care or child health care, then you need to do other things to make them functioning or productive members of society throughout, like increasing access to education, increasing other welfare type programs to increase the quality of life so they can be a productive, part of the UK's economy. This starts to evolve then from the Great Consensus into the policies of Margaret Thatcher when she takes control in the late 70s. This 3-minute theory video kind of outlines what neoliberalism is, which becomes the economic and political model that Thatcher really starts to deploy. And I'll warn you that this video starts with a fairly solid definition of what neoliberalism is, and then spends about a minute and a half, 2 minutes talking about why this group thinks neoliberalism is bad. And what I want you to take from this video is that definition of what neoliberalism is and how it operates, but then also think of some of the criticisms of neoliberalism and how that could be used by the Labour Party after, decades of conservative rule. So watch this video and we'll kind of apply neoliberalism to Thatcher momentarily. Thatcher, like I said earlier, is a folk hero to some, a villain to others, where she rises to power and becomes the prime minister of and the leader of the Conservative Party for 11 years, from 1979 to 1990. She looked at the collective consensus, and she looked at some of the economic struggles of the late 70s and early 80s and said that the reason why the economy in the UK is struggling is because of all of those collectivist policies, because of welfare, because of labor unions, because of command economic structures. And in order to eliminate those economic drains, that the government needed to get the hell out of the way of the market. So she called for massive privatization, that you saw elimination of state-owned enterprises, that anything that the British government owned, they sold off in the name of the market being able to hopefully better manage these institutions. She cut back on the social welfare programs, and this is where she gets a lovely name as like the milk snatcher, because she wanted to, when she was the Minister of Education, get rid of some of those handouts, like free milk as part of a school lunch. The argument was scaling back the state role in kind of increasing the quality of life was necessary to promote economic growth, which, if you think about kind of the underlying argument of the grand consensus, those welfare programs were being done in the name of economic growth. So her argument becomes, they may have stimulated some growth, but they became kind of too big to succeed, or were too demanding, or the government was manipulating markets too much. She was tough on labor unions because all labor unions do is try and protect workers' rights to increase their quality of life, and those are all things that minimize or eliminate profit. And in the eyes of a neoliberalist, right, those are bad. That if the goal of the market is to maximize profit, to maximize growth, then, right, labor unions should not have a worrisome relationship with the government or with politics or with policymaking. That should be between employers and the workers, and not between the workers and the government. She started pushing more and more for a free market economic model of development, and this kind of becomes a good case study on the influence of neoliberalism. That this was a revival of classical liberal values that are all about competition, that are all about free market capitalism, that are all about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, that businesses should be able to compete with one another, and that government should not regulate the markets, that the market should find a way to regulate itself. So if two people both owned factories that made light bulbs, one of them made cheap light bulbs that in the name of profit, they were, environmentally terrible. The owner of that factory offered low wages, the quality of life for its workers were low. And in factory B, the light bulbs were more expensive, but they were environmentally friendly, that the workers were treated well and fairly. Thatcher's argument would not be that the government needs to step in and make factory A more like factory B. Thatcher's argument is that if you, a consumer, wanted to buy products that were environmentally friendly, buy products that were made through workers who were treated fairly, then you would buy those products. And then if enough people started purchasing light bulbs from factory B, that the power of the market, those non-regulated forces, would force factory A to reform their environmental human rights practices. Here is kind of a quick little video that you can watch on your own time that kind of highlights Thatcher shooting down elements of command economics. She gets mad at the proposition of a singular European currency, where you can kind of see her thought process in action. And I'm going to skip this question. You can look at the reasoning about the contradiction between neoliberalism and what we believe is a liberal versus conservative ideology in the United States. Like I said, Margaret Thatcher is kind of seen as both a hero and a villain of her time. That she gets, the self-proclaimed nickname, the Iron Lady, because she was firm and relentless in dealing with foreign countries. That some people saw her as this cold, heartless witch who just aimed to cut government programs, but some people saw her, like the cartoon in the bottom left corner of the slide, that they saw her as a superhero and kind of dismantling large, unproductive elements of the British state. This video you can watch on your time is where she kind of jokes about being the Iron Lady. And she died a couple years ago. And to kind of highlight the fact that she was controversial both in life and death is that there was a goal from a lot of people who were not big fans of Thatcher to make the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead a #1 trending hit on things like iTunes and Amazon or Google Play when she died, because a lot of people honestly felt that when she was removed from power, maybe the conservatives would soften, maybe the new Labor Party would restore some of the economic things that were necessary, and that they could maybe go back to some of the elements of the days of the collective consensus. This BBC video talks about whether or not the media should censor or ban the playing of Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead around her funeral. The last thing I want to talk about with Margaret Thatcher is kind of how she falls out of power. That in 1990, you're starting to see a bit of an economic hiccup. You're starting to see some infighting within the party. You're starting to see some of the things that she was good at managing from 1979 to the late 1980s really come back to bite her. And there's a lot of controversy around Margaret Thatcher and the end of her political career, because a lot of people would frame what happened to Thatcher as a mode of political assassination, where her peers in the Conservative Party told her, we don't think you should run, we don't think you can win against a challenger for the leader of the Conservative Party, and she's kind of forced to bow out. And this video from Channel 4 News kind of does a good job of showing conservatives who believe that Thatcher was taken down by an internal hatchet job, and you see some conservatives saying, no, none of that happened. So there's even a great deal of controversy in dealing with the political demise of Margaret Thatcher after her death. And if you want to see a pretty okay movie that kind of highlights the rise and fall of Margaret Thatcher, you can watch the film The Iron Lady. We'll stop here, and we will pick back up and talk about the rise of Tony Blair. We will talk about the coalition government between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, and then we'll wrap up by talking about the downfall of David Cameron and the rise of Theresa May.